The day the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse started taking on water, Linda Carver screamed my name like I'd summoned the storm myself. I was standing at the edge of my driveway with a mug of black coffee cooling in my hand, watching brown floodwater curl around the white stone flower beds outside the clubhouse entrance like it had finally found the address it had been looking for all along. Plastic patio chairs drifted sideways across the lawn. The little sandwich board by the front walk, the one that always said something cheerful about wine nights and community yoga, had tipped face first into the mud. I could smell wet mulch, chlorine from the clubhouse pool, and that sour, swampy odor that rises when too much water sits where it was never supposed to be. Linda was out there in spotless tennis whites that weren't spotless anymore, pointing across the street at me with one manicured hand while the other clutched her phone like she was about to call God and file a complaint. But the truth was simple. I didn't dump that water anywhere. I just made sure it finally stopped dumping into my yard. My name is Evan Brooks. I'm 41 years old, born and raised in Central Texas, and I've spent most of my adult life fixing the kind of problems rich people pretend not to understand until they start ruining something expensive. Drainage, grading, concrete settlement, runoff control. You'd be amazed how many people will spend 80 grand on a backyard kitchen and exactly $0 figuring out where the rain is supposed to go. Water doesn't care about denial. It doesn't care about landscaping committees or decorative stone walls or whether the clubhouse has imported tile from somewhere with too many vowels in the name. Water follows slope. It follows pressure. It follows the path somebody gave it. And 3 months before Linda Carver started yelling in the rain, somebody had given it my backyard. The first time I noticed it, I heard it before I saw it. A hard, hollow rush under my fence line at about 2 in the morning, right after one of those spring storms that rolls through fast and leaves the air smelling like torn grass and hot pavement gone cold. I stepped onto my back porch in bare feet and felt the boards damp under my soles. The security light kicked on. My yard looked like a shallow pond. The flower beds my mother helped me plant the year I bought the place were half underwater. My mower shed sat in 3 inches of muddy runoff, and the narrow strip of gravel behind the garage had already started to wash out in a crooked line toward the alley. I remember standing there listening to the water hiss through a fresh cut in the earth near the rear fence, smelling that nasty mix of clay, fertilizer, and stagnant ditch water, and realizing this wasn't just storm runoff. This had direction. Intent. By sunrise, I found the source. Behind the privacy fence that separated my lot from HOA common property, there was a new drainage swale carved along the rear easement, clean-edged and raw, the kind of cut a contractor crew makes with a skid steer and no conscience. Fresh tire marks. Disturbed soil. Crushed flags from an old survey line. Somebody had regraded the common area behind my house and aimed the overflow straight into my yard like it was a legal dumping ground. And when I brought it to Linda Carver that morning, she gave me a smile so polished it felt machine-made, glanced at the mud on my boots, and said, "Mr. Brooks, stormwater has to go somewhere." What she didn't know was that I make a living proving exactly where it's allowed to go. That was the thing about people like Linda Carver. They always said the quiet part in a voice sweet enough to sound reasonable. Stormwater has to go somewhere. She said it standing under the covered entrance of the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse with a stainless steel travel cup in one hand and a folder of violation notices tucked under her arm like she was carrying scripture. Behind her, the landscaping crew she had hired was still loading tools into a trailer. I could smell diesel, wet cedar mulch, and that sharp chemical scent fresh sod gives off when it has been laid too fast on ground that has not settled right. Linda tilted her head when she spoke to me, not like a neighbor, more like a principal explaining to a problem student why the rules only seemed unfair because he had not read them properly. She was in her early 50s, always put together, always glowing with the kind of polish that comes from never doing the hard part yourself. White visor. Gold bracelet. Smile tight enough to crack in cold weather. I had met plenty of people like her on job sites over the years. The kind who called drainage a landscaping issue until it backed into their wine cellar. Then it can go where it has always gone, I told her. She gave a small laugh and flipped open the folder. Actually, the board approved improvements to the common drainage corridor last week. Everything was done professionally. I looked past her at the slope behind the clubhouse and then back toward my lot. Professionally. That word almost made me smile. Anybody who knew grading could see what they had done. They had shaved the rear common strip by maybe 8 inches in some places, maybe more near the tree line, just enough to increase flow velocity during heavy rain. Then they cut a shallow feeder trench that ran along the fence until it found the lowest point behind my shed. No retaining lip. No catch basin. No rock check. No proper outlet. Just a clean dirt channel aimed at my property like a loaded finger. The whole thing had been built to solve one problem by moving it onto somebody with less political pull. I asked for the plans. Linda tapped the folder and said the board records were private. I asked for the contractor name. She said I could submit a formal request through management. I asked if anyone had notified the adjacent property owner before regrading along a shared drainage line. That was when the smile changed. Not gone. Just colder. Mr. Brooks, with respect, your lot has had standing water issues since before the improvements. Several residents have noticed it. Perhaps this is a maintenance matter on your end. I actually looked behind me to make sure she was talking about my yard. I keep my place clean. Not manicured like the front entrances in that neighborhood, but solid. Grass cut. Fence stained. Gravel straight. Gutters clear. The kind of property that belongs to a man who owns his tools and uses them. My lot did not flood until your crew cut that. Swale, I said. She shrugged like weather had a mind of its own and this was all beneath her. Then document whatever you believe is happening. That landed differently than she meant it to. Because documentation is where I live. I did not argue after that. I just nodded once and walked back to my truck. The morning sun was already burning through the storm haze, turning the wet pavement silver. I could hear sprinklers ticking across the median islands, watering ground that had gotten soaked all night while my backyard still held 6 inches of brown runoff. By the time I got home, the mud around my shed had started to cake and split on top, but every step still sank half an inch. I stood there in the sticky heat, looking at the wash line on my fence posts, the drowned liriope along the porch, the trail of silt left behind like a signature. Then I saw something that made me crouch down in the muck. A crushed orange survey flag half buried near the cut under the fence. County marking tape. Old, faded, probably from the original grading line years ago. Somebody had dug right through it. I rubbed the clay off between my fingers and felt the first click of real suspicion settle into place. Because crews do sloppy work all the time. But when they ignore a survey line, that is not sloppiness. That is confidence. The kind of confidence people get when they think nobody on the other side knows how to read the ground. That confidence bothered me more than the flooding. Rain is one thing. Carelessness is another. But confidence means somebody believed they had the room, the authority, and the protection to reshape the land and let me deal with the consequences. So I started doing what I always do when a site feels wrong. I stopped looking at the mess and started reading it. The next morning I got up before sunrise, pulled on my work boots, and walked the fence line with a grade rod, a line level, marking paint, and a legal pad that still smelled faintly like sawdust from the truck. The air was heavy and damp, the kind of sticky Texas morning where your shirt starts clinging before the sun even clears the roofs. Birds were making a racket in the live oaks behind the common area, and every few feet my boots made that wet sucking sound in the mud where the runoff had not fully drained. I measured everything twice. Fence corner to shed slab. Shed slab to the rear swale. Rear swale to the common strip behind the fence. By 8 o'clock I had enough numbers to make my jaw tighten. The common area behind my lot had been lowered just enough to create pitch toward my yard, and the channel they cut was not some incidental wash line from a storm. It was deliberate. Clean fall, direct path, no natural spread. The water had been given a lane and my backyard had been assigned the bill. I drove to the county records office that afternoon still carrying the orange survey flag in my glove box like a piece of evidence. County buildings all smell the same: old paper, floor wax, stale air conditioning, and coffee that has been sitting too long on a burner. I asked for the original plat, drainage easement maps, grading permits, anything tied to the Willow Creek Estates common tract behind my street. The clerk was a guy named Russell with silver reading glasses and a voice like gravel. He looked at the subdivision name, typed for a minute, then frowned at the screen. "You want the original development packet too?" he asked. "Everything," I said. He slid a stack of copies across the counter 20 minutes later, thick enough to stop a door. I took them home, spread them across my kitchen table, and started tracing lines while leftover storm clouds turned the backyard light grey through the window. There it was. Original grading notes from when the development went in 12 years earlier. Rear common drainage was supposed to sheet flow west into a rock-lined interception ditch, then feed a buried storm line that discharged near the retention pond by the front entrance. Not south. Not through my fence line. Not into my shed. Somebody had changed the path without updating the design. I kept reading. There was also a drainage easement running behind the lots on my side of the street, but it specifically prohibited concentrated discharge onto adjoining private property. The language was dry and technical, but to me it sounded like a bell ringing. They were not just rude. They were wrong on paper. Then came the part that made the whole thing personal. 2 days later another storm rolled in just after dark, one of those fast loud ones that rattles the windows and leaves the neighborhood smelling like ozone and wet concrete. I stood on my back porch with a flashlight and watched that fresh-cut channel wake up like it had been waiting all week. Water surged through the trench, hit the low spot by my fence, and spilled into the yard in a brown curling sheet. Within minutes it reached the shed again. I waded out in ankle-deep muck and opened the door. Inside, a cardboard box on the bottom shelf had soaked through and collapsed. It held my father's old field notebooks from when he worked county utility surveys back in the 1990s, pages full of neat pencil marks and elevation sketches he used to let me study when I was a kid. I lifted one of the books and watched muddy water drip off the cover. The paper smelled like silt and mildew. That was the moment this stopped being about nuisance drainage. Linda had not just sent water into my yard. She had washed it into something I could not replace. The next morning the storm had moved on, but the smell it left behind had not. Wet wood. Sour mud. That rank, mineral stink that clings to standing water after it has sat too long against concrete and roots and things that were meant to stay dry. I had every one of my father's notebooks laid open across old bath towels in the garage, pages fanned out under 2 box fans that hummed like tired engines. Some of the pencil marks had survived. Some had bled into grey ghosts. I stood there with my hands on my hips, staring at those warped covers, and felt that cold kind of anger settle in, the useful kind. Not loud. Not reckless. Just sharp. By 9 that morning I had photographed everything. The shed threshold. The mud line on the siding. The washout behind the garage. The trench along the fence. The ruined notebooks. I took wide shots, close shots, time-stamped shots. Then I filed a formal complaint with the county engineering office, attached the original plat, the easement language, and a summary of what the drainage path used to be versus what it had become. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA management company demanding preservation of any records related to the recent grading work. People get careless when they think a problem is small. The trick is making it official before they realize it is not. 3 days later I got my first answer, and it came in the form of a white envelope tucked into my mailbox with the HOA crest printed in dark green on the corner. Even before I opened it, I could feel the paper weight. Violation notice. Excessive mud accumulation visible from neighboring common areas. Improper outbuilding maintenance due to water staining. Failure to maintain landscape standards. I stood at the end of my driveway in the noon heat reading that nonsense while cicadas screamed from the cedar trees and a lawn crew buzzed half a block away. They had flooded my yard and then fined me for looking flooded. I laughed once, just under my breath, because there is a point where arrogance stops being insulting and starts being useful. Useful people leave fingerprints. I walked that letter straight into the garage, laid it beside the ruined notebooks, and took another photograph. Then came the newsletter. Willow Creek Estate sent out a weekly email full of picnic announcements, board reminders, and cheerful little lies about community improvement. That Friday there was a paragraph about recent drainage enhancements designed to protect common amenities from standing water and erosion. It thanked the board for acting decisively and asked residents to report any neighboring lots that appeared to be obstructing runoff with unapproved structures or neglect. I read it twice on my phone while sitting in my truck outside a supplier yard, engine idling, cold air blowing against the sweat on my neck. They were building a story now. Quietly. Paper first. Blame second. By the time most people realize that is happening, they are already cast as the problem. I went home and walked the rear line again. The cut behind my fence had widened another 2 inches in places from the last storm, and I found fresh boot impressions in the soft clay on the common side. Not random prints either. Work boots, square toe, deep heel pattern, recent. Someone had been back there after the rain. I crouched low and followed the marks until I found where they stopped near the bend behind my shed. The trench had been cleaned out. Not by weather. By a shovel. The edges were sharper than before, the loose silt scooped aside in little crescent piles that had not yet crusted over in the sun. They were maintaining the flow path. That evening I drove past the clubhouse just before sunset. The parking lot smelled warm and tarry after a long day of heat, and the sprinkler heads were ticking across the front lawn in perfect little arcs while the retention pond near the entrance sat half empty. Half empty. That detail stayed with me. They had a legal outfall. They had room. They had infrastructure built into the original plan. And still they had pushed the overflow away from their amenities and onto my property instead. Through the tall front windows of the clubhouse I could see Linda at a board table with 3 other residents, all iced tea and polished wood and soft yellow lighting. She laughed at something, then leaned forward and tapped a document with one long fingernail. I watched her for maybe 10 seconds before driving on. I did not need to hear the conversation. I already knew the tone. She thought this was one more blue-collar homeowner she could bury in notices and delay until the ground dried and the evidence blurred. What she did not understand was that dry ground can lie. Grey does not. And by then I had enough paper, enough measurements, and enough mud on my boots to know one thing for sure. I was done asking where the water came from. My next step was proving exactly where it was supposed to go. The county engineering office called me on a Tuesday just after lunch while I was out estimating a cracked patio slab on the north side of town. The sky was clear, hard blue, the kind of heat that makes every white truck in Texas look brighter than it should. I was standing beside my tailgate with a laser measure in one hand when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The woman on the line introduced herself as Dana Mercer, civil technician, and her voice had that clipped, capable sound of somebody who spent her day sorting facts from excuses. She told me they had reviewed the complaint packet, compared it against the recorded drainage exhibits, and flagged the matter for field inspection. Not a ruling. Not yet. But enough to get boots on the ground. I thanked her, wrote down the appointment time on the back of a receipt, and felt the first real shift in the air. Once county people start walking a site, stories matter less than slope. I spent the next 24 hours getting ready like I was prepping for a foundation pour. I printed the original plat full size. I highlighted the easement language. I organized photographs by date, storm event, and damage area. I even pulled weather data to show rainfall totals because people like Linda always love to pretend an ordinary storm was some once-in-a-century act of God when ordinary negligence is no longer convenient. By Wednesday morning my kitchen table looked like a case file. Papers clipped in neat stacks. Muddy boots by the back door. Coffee going cold beside a yellow legal pad dense with notes. When Dana arrived, she came in a county pickup with a survey wheel in the bed and a man named Lewis who handled field measurements. Both of them wore sun-faded safety vests and neutral expressions. My favorite kind of professionals. No speeches. No HOA smiles. Just clipboards, tape, and eyes that noticed things. I walked them through the yard first. The shed. The wash line. The collapsed edge behind the garage. The cut under the fence. Dana crouched at the trench and ran 2 fingers along the edge of the soil, then looked up at Lewis without saying a word. He only nodded once and started measuring. We went behind the fence by access path through the common strip, and even before we reached the regrade section I could hear the crunch of dry clay breaking under our boots where machinery had compacted the surface. Dana stopped near the rear swale and asked who performed the work. I told her the HOA refused to provide contractor records. That got another note on the clipboard. She paced the line toward the clubhouse side, checked elevation points, then stood still for a second staring toward the front retention system like she was running the whole route in her head. They bypassed their designed interception path, she said finally. Quietly. Almost to herself. Hearing somebody official say what I already knew felt less like victory and more like oxygen. But Linda was not done making things easier for me. She arrived halfway through the inspection in a white sport utility vehicle that rolled up too fast for a routine visit and stopped near the curb with a sharp spray of gravel. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and one of those sleeveless country club tops that look expensive even when they are trying to seem casual. The perfume reached us before her words did, sweet and artificial against the smell of hot dirt and cut grass. I wish someone had informed the board before trespassing through our common landscaping, she said, and Dana did not even look up before replying, County Inspection under Filed Complaint Authority. Linda's mouth tightened at that. Then she switched tactics and turned to me like we were 2 adults dealing with an unfortunate misunderstanding. Evan, if this is about drainage again, the board has already addressed your concerns. I almost admired that sentence. So polished. So empty. I pointed to the trench under my fence and said nothing. Dana asked whether the board had approved recent grading modifications, and Linda answered yes. Then Dana asked for the permit number. For the first time since I had met her, Linda Carver did not have a reply ready. You could hear the wind moving through the oaks behind the lots. A sprinkler ticking near the clubhouse. Somewhere down the block, a garage door humming open. Small sounds. Honest sounds. Linda removed her sunglasses slowly and said the work was minor landscape adjustment. Dana wrote that down too. When the county truck pulled away an hour later, I stood in my driveway watching dust settle back onto the road and knew the game had changed. The water was still their weapon. But paperwork had started becoming mine. The county did not move fast enough for Linda, so she tried to get ahead of the facts. 2 days after the inspection, I came home to find bright little utility flags stuck in the ground along the rear fence line of my yard like somebody had started marking out a fresh project without bothering to ask whose dirt they were standing on. Pink. Orange. Yellow. Tiny scraps of plastic snapping in the warm evening breeze above the mud-stained grass. My first thought was that the county had come back. My second thought was that county crews do not leave anonymous notes zip-tied to a gate latch. The note was printed on thick cream paper with the HOA crest in the corner. Emergency drainage access required. Do not remove markers. Board authorized. I stood there at my own back gate with sweat drying under my collar and read it twice just to enjoy how wrong it was. They had not learned anything from the inspection. If anything, they had panicked and decided panic looked better in letterhead. I pulled every flag out of the ground one by one and laid them on the patio table like a collection of bad ideas. Then I mounted 2 more cameras under the eaves and aimed them at the fence line. That night the air felt electric even though there was no storm yet, just low clouds moving in from the west and the smell of damp cedar rolling over the neighborhood. I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow light over the sink, the original plat open beside my father's drying notebooks, and started sketching something I had resisted thinking about too soon. Not revenge. Not sabotage. Just correction. Clean, legal, engineered correction. The original drainage path was still there on paper. The retention system by the front entrance still had capacity. The rear common strip still had enough fall to carry sheet flow west before feeding the designed line. The only reason the water had been entering my property was because the HOA had concentrated it, cut the wrong channel, and used my low corner as a pressure release valve. Water is lazy until somebody gives it a shortcut. Then it gets obedient. The more I stared at the maps, the more obvious the answer became. I did not need to fight the storm. I just needed to deny it the illegal path they had carved through my fence line and re-establish the lawful one on my side of the boundary. A shallow earthen berm tied into a compacted edge. A rockline swale angle to shed force. A culvert sleeve at the right point to prevent ponding near the shed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just enough grade discipline to keep concentrated discharge from crossing into my yard and to send the water back toward the common system it should have been using all along. I spent the next morning taking fresh measurements with a transit level while the sun climbed hot and white over the roofs. Cicadas rattled in the trees. Somebody 2 streets over was pressure washing a driveway, that high whining spray carrying through the still air. On my side of the fence, I drove grade stakes, marked elevations in black ink, and checked them again. Then I called a soil supplier I trust and ordered crushed limestone, drained rock, and 3 loads of fill. The guy on the phone asked if I was fixing a washout. Something like that, I said. By afternoon I had also called an attorney, a local property man named Greg Holloway who charged by the hour and spoke in careful sentences. I laid out everything for him. The altered grade. The county inspection. The violation notices. The easement language. My proposed corrective work. He listened without interrupting, then said the most beautiful words a homeowner can hear. If your improvements remain entirely on your property and restore lawful drainage conditions without concentrated discharge onto someone else's land, they are going to have a very hard time complaining. Hard time complaining. I wrote that down. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off, too far to matter yet but close enough to remind me the clock was running. That evening Linda herself came to my door for the first time since all this started. I opened it to the smell of rain in the distance and expensive perfume up close. She stood there with that same practiced smile, though it looked thinner now, stretched over something anxious. I hope we can avoid escalating this, she said. The board is willing to discuss a cooperative solution. Cooperative. That word almost made me laugh. I looked past her toward the street where her white sport utility vehicle gleamed under the porch light. Spotless as ever, and then back at her. So am I said. That is exactly what I have been preparing. She nodded like she thought I was finally folding. But I had already ordered the rock. I had already checked the grade. And for the first time since the water crossed my fence, I knew precisely what the next rain was going to teach her. The materials showed up at 7:15 the next morning on a flatbed that rattled my windows before I even poured coffee. 3 loads of fill, drained rock, crushed limestone, and a section of heavy culvert sleeve rolled into my driveway under a sky the color of brushed steel. The air smelled like dust, diesel, and the strange metallic tang that always comes before a real storm. I had already laid out the line with string, stakes, and marking paint, every measurement checked twice against the plat and once against the actual fall of the yard. There is a kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly what the ground wants to do if people would stop lying to it. I worked alone most of the morning. Shovel, rake, plate compactor, transit level. Boot sinking, then finding firmer purchase as the grade started taking shape. I built the berm low and clean, just high enough to stop concentrated flow from crossing the fence cut. Then I tied it into a shallow rockline swale that angled the pressure off the rear corner and guided anything pushing from the common strip back toward the west line where the original sheet flow belonged. Near the shed I set the culvert sleeve under a compacted lip to keep any backup from pooling where the notebooks had been ruined. Nothing on my side of the property was decorative. Every inch had a reason. By noon my shirt was dark with sweat and the skin on my forearms was streaked with dust and clay. The compactor thumped against the ground with a deep steady sound that makes loose soil finally accept reality. Twice I caught movement through the slats in the fence. Somebody watching. Once I heard a phone camera click from the common side, faint but unmistakable. I kept working. By 3 o'clock the line was finished, the rock was set, and the corrected channel on my property looked like it had always belonged there. Subtle. Practical. The kind of work nobody notices until it matters. Around 4, Linda came marching down the side access path with 2 board members trailing behind her like backup singers in khakis. Even from 30 feet away I could smell her perfume cutting through the storm air. "You cannot alter drainage conditions without board approval," she called over the fence. I tamped the last section of limestone, shut off the machine, and looked at her through the mesh of pecan leaves moving in the wind. "Good thing this is not your board's property," I said. She asked if I had permits. I told her county rules did not require a permit for corrective grading entirely within a private lot, provided it did not create unlawful discharge. Her face changed at the word unlawful. One of the board members, a thin man in a polo shirt with a face like a nervous accountant, leaned toward her and whispered something. She ignored him. "If this causes damage to community property," she said, "the association will hold you responsible." I glanced toward the clubhouse roofline visible above the trees and then back at her. "Then it is a good thing I sent my plans to council before I started." That shut her up for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for thunder to roll closer, low and steady, like a truck crossing a bridge. The first drop hit the patio rail at 5:12. Then another. Then 10 more. Within minutes the sky opened in that hard vertical Texas way, rain slamming the yard, the fence, the roof, the rock channel, everything at once. I stood under the back porch and watched the trench beyond my fence wake up like it always did, brown water racing toward the old cut with all the confidence Linda had paid for. Only this time it met the berm, curled, hesitated, and shifted. The pressure spread into the swale exactly like the numbers said it would. Instead of punching through my yard, the runoff peeled west, found the grade, and headed back across the common strip toward the path it should have been using from the beginning. I listened to the water move over stone with that smooth rushing sound that tells you gravity has finally stopped arguing and started cooperating. Then, somewhere beyond the trees toward the front of the subdivision, I heard somebody yell. The yelling got louder as the rain came down harder. Not panic exactly at first, more like offended confusion, the sound people make when nature suddenly stops honoring a lie they got comfortable with. I stepped off the porch and walked along the side yard under the edge of the gutter line, just far enough to keep the front entrance of the subdivision in view through the trees. The water was moving fast now, not wild, not chaotic, just committed. It ran along the corrected grade, crossed the common strip, and headed toward the original low side where the interception line should have been catching it all along. But the HOA had neglected that path for months while they carved their shortcut through my fence line, so the front common area took the first hit before the overburdened storm inlet could swallow it. By the time I reached the corner of my driveway, runoff was already spreading across the grass beside the clubhouse in a wide brown fan, curling around the decorative stone sign and pushing mulch out of the flower beds in little dark waves. The smell hit me next, wet bark, churned clay, and chlorine from the pool deck drains backing up under too much surface flow. Linda was out there in the rain with no umbrella now, hair plastered to her forehead, white top ruined to a color somewhere between beige and surrender. She was shouting at a maintenance man to move patio furniture while one of the board members tried to drag the sandwich board out of the water and only managed to splash himself from the knees down. It would have been funny if it had not been so predictable. That was the part that stayed with me. None of this was random. The water was not attacking them. It was returning to the burden they had pushed away. Linda spotted me standing at the edge of my driveway and came sloshing across the curb line in shoes that were absolutely not made for mud. "What did you do?" she yelled over the rain. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I fixed my property," I said. She pointed toward the clubhouse lawn where the runoff had begun to pool against the low walk leading to the side entrance. "You redirected everything here." "No," I said. I stopped it from entering my yard. For a second she just stared at me, breathing hard, rainwater running off her chin, phone still clutched in one hand like it might save her if she waved it hard enough. Then the county field technician, Dana Mercer, pulled into the front lot in a rain-spattered pickup and stepped out wearing a hooded jacket and that same calm expression she had carried during the inspection. I had sent her my grading photos and my counsel letter the moment the work was done, and apparently she had chosen a very educational time to check the site. She looked at the flow, looked at the common strip, looked at the water pushing around the clubhouse walk, and then looked directly at the neglected front interception line half clogged with leaves, silt, and fresh landscape debris. That inlet should have been maintained and this path should never have been bypassed, she said, loud enough for Linda and the board members to hear over the storm. I will never forget the silence that followed. Not because the rain had stopped. It had not. But because the argument had. You could hear water slapping against the stone edging, the hiss of runoff entering the overloaded drain, the squeak of wet rubber soles on concrete as residents gathered under the awning to watch their board stand there with nowhere left to point. Linda opened her mouth once, closed it, and finally looked away from me. That was the moment she understood the difference between causing a problem and allowing one to come home. The county report landed 8 days later, and it read exactly the way truth sounds when it has finally been typed on official paper. Unauthorized grading alteration of common drainage. Failure to maintain designed interception infrastructure. Concentrated discharge onto adjoining private property. Recommended corrective action, immediate restoration of approved flow path, removal of unpermitted modifications in the rear common tract, inspection of the front storm inlet network, and compensation review for documented private property damage. I read the whole thing once at my kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window over the sink, then read it again slower with a cup of coffee in my hand and my father's salvaged field notebooks drying on the shelf behind me. Some of the pages had curled permanently. Some of the pencil marks would always be faint. But they were still there. That mattered. 2 days after the report, the HOA attorney sent Greg Holloway a letter full of careful language and the legal equivalent of clearing a throat. They wanted to resolve the matter efficiently. They wanted to avoid unnecessary escalation. They wanted to discuss remediation, cost sharing, and a mutually agreeable drainage restoration plan. Greg called me while I was loading bags of mortar at a supply yard and read the best part out loud twice just so we could both enjoy it. The association agrees that prior runoff conditions may have adversely impacted the Brooks property. Prior runoff conditions. That is a fancy little phrase for we got caught. The settlement came together over the next 3 weeks. The HOA paid for replacement landscaping, shed repairs, soil restoration, and document conservation treatment for what could be saved of my father's notebooks. They also had to hire a licensed civil engineer to redesign and restore the rear common drainage to match the recorded development intent, this time with permits, inspection, and maintenance requirements that could not be hidden behind board emails and white envelopes. The clubhouse lawn was torn up for almost a month while crews reworked the front interception line and cleared the buried storm route that should have been handling the flow from the start. Every time I drove past, there were orange barrels, stacked pipe, mud mats, and workers in safety vests doing the kind of honest correction Linda had spent all summer trying to avoid. The sign out front still said "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates," but now it sat beside a temporary construction notice taller than the flower bed. Linda stopped appearing at the clubhouse after that. For a while I heard she was still sending messages in the neighborhood forum, still trying to frame the whole thing as a regrettable engineering misunderstanding. Then one evening I came home and saw a notice posted in the glass case by the mail kiosk announcing a special board election. Her name was not on the slate. No scandal. No dramatic speech. Just absence. That felt right. Some people do not lose power all at once. Sometimes it drains out of them the same way water drains off a bad grade, slowly, visibly, and with nowhere else to go. The first hard rain after the repairs came in early October. I stood on my back porch and watched it hit the yard in silver lines. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, rain on cedar, wet limestone, fresh soil settling where it was supposed to settle.